Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 3rd of March, and today we're going to be covering the recent Russian advances in Novomykhailivka and Ivanivske. We'll look at the Ukrainian attempted counterattacks to the west of Avdiivka. But let's actually begin by looking at where Ukraine was successful, and that is around the village of Tabaivka. This was reported on the 1st of March by Deep State that the Ukrainians were able to advance around 2 square kilometers in the westernmost sections of the village, which I'll mark in blue for you guys, the area where the Ukrainians were able to gain a foothold. This includes mainly forested areas and some of the houses within the village. And so now it's contested with the Russian forces still holding on to tree lines that are just to the east of Tabaivka. Again, due to the fighting over here being pretty low intensity, then we don't really see that many changes. The Russian forces were able to develop an attack vector from the rail line to the south of Kislivka and Kotlyarivka over a month ago now, and that's when they were actually able to infiltrate into Tabaivka. The front line was stabilized eventually due to the Tabaivka village being located on a valley that is overlooked by the Ukrainian defensive positions that are set up around the forested areas in this ridge that's generally marked over here in this blue rectangle. And due to the rugged terrain, the Russian forces were unable to set up permanent positions within the village, and over time they lost the initiative, and the Ukrainians had a window of opportunity recently to conduct localized counterattacks, and that's when they were able to re-enter the village. And during the same time period, the Ukrainian defenders did slightly uptick the amount of artillery and mortar strikes. So just as one example, you had one Russian BMP being destroyed by the Ivanivske brigade. I believe that's a National Guard unit. It was moved into the sector to help hold the line and was involved in the recent Ukrainian attacks. And then more generally, the Ukrainian defense in this area is composed of several territorial defense units and these newly formed mechanized brigades like the 88th. But this is one of the lower intensity parts of the front line, so I'll move southwards to Ivanivske. Likely around the night of February 29th, the Russian forces were able to increase their control within Ivanivske. And in my last video, I talked about the order of battle, so not to get into it, but it's largely elements from the 98th and 106th VDV divisions. And so those units were involved in breaking past the Ukrainian resistance that was holding up the front line in the easternmost outskirts of the village. And it was verified by Deep State on the 1st of March that the Russian forces were able to move past their line of contact that was set around these red lines and get control of most of the eastern sections of the village. That includes areas along the T0504 highway and several warehouses and just generally residential areas and some nearby tree lines. And so now most of Ivanivske, at least in the western section, is a gray zone, with the Ukrainians largely having their defensive positions set up in the rather forested areas to the west. That includes this height located over here, where you do have Ukrainian defenders set up, and you also do have a lot of forested areas that are just to the east of the Donbass Canal, so those are also located on relatively high elevated areas. But nonetheless, within Ivanivske itself, the Russian forces are continuing to advance, and at the same time that opens up new vectors of attack for the Russian forces to get control over the nearby heights. So for instance, you have very important heights that are currently in a gray zone directly to the north of Ivanivske. The Russians definitely have their eyes set on that. And to the south of Ivanivske, all of these open fields in between Klishivka and Ivanivske are located in a higher elevated area that overlooks Klishivka and also overlooks Ivanivske. But right now, the Ukrainian troop concentration in this area is pretty low. It's larger around Klishivka and that general sector, and it's also larger to the north around Chasiv Yar. But in this area in between, although I have a lot of unit icons, they are not fully present in this direction. And so it will be interesting to see whether the Russians push into that area or whether the Ukrainians attempt to reinforce it in order to protect Klishivka's northern flank. Now moving on to the Avdiivka front, the period from February 29th to today, the 3rd of March, has largely been defined by Ukrainian attempts at retaining control of their first line of defense past Avdiivka, and this defense has manifested itself in actually conducting counterattacks mainly on the flanks of Simonivka. That's really Ukraine's goal, trying to retain control of villages, of tree lines that are to the north and to the south of this village, in order for this to act as the nexus of the Ukrainian defense, at least for several days or weeks, depending on their time frame. And as we can see, most of the fighting has been concentrated around Tonenke and Berdichi. The Ukrainians have moved in a lot of the reinforcements that they sent into the sector to be involved in these attacks. So that includes a lot of the new units that have not been attrited yet in the offensive activities, but also some units that have been involved in the fighting even since the beginning of the Battle of Avdiivka. And so in terms of new units that are involved, you're seeing a lot of participation of the 3rd Battalion of the 25th Airborne Brigade. They were moved in from the Luhansk front, I believe. You're seeing a lot from the 47th Mechanized Brigade. There is likely some involvement of the 53rd Mechanized Brigade, which has been holding the southern flank of Avdiivka, or was holding it throughout the battle, and has now been forced to evacuate its positions in Tonenke. So they were generally in the sector as well. And of course you have Azov, which has been moved back from the rear after it was sent back for training and for recuperation for several months. Now it's fighting all across the Donetsk front, not just in Avdiivka, but also around Krasnohorivka. And so they've been in very big parts of the recent attack. Starting off with Tonenke, the Russian forces entered this village by the end of February, and that assault was largely carried out by the 1st Slavic Motor Rifle Brigade with support from the 6th Motor Rifle Division. And so that was the armored elements that were involved in advancing from Severina into the Tonenke axis. And so the Russian forces during this time period, of course, they released videos like raising the flag in the eastern section of the village, but they did not have much time to solidify control over the western sections because the Ukrainians then commenced their localized counterattack. And in this direction, it was largely done because of the significance that Tonenke offers. As I said before, it is on the southern flank of Ivanivske and does provide the Russians a way to cross past the water barriers in this section and attack the Ukrainian defenses that were built on the ridge to the west of Simonivka from the southern flank. Additionally, the attack axis around Tonenke would give the Russians access to Umanske, which is also a relatively fortified village. And Umanske itself is pretty important because it connects via the roads that you can see on the map that are marked in yellow several other key Ukrainian defenses in the sector, like Netelove. So in the sector, you had the 25th Airborne Brigade, the 53rd Mechanized Brigade, and Azov involved in armored assaults, which started off likely on Umanske, and then from there they entered through some of the paved roads or through open fields and set up camp in this northwestern section of the village. And at that point, you had pretty heavy grad shelling of the Ukrainian positions, and you had Russian artillery strikes launched towards the specific road over here that runs through the northwestern section of the village. This is where a lot of the armored formations were located when they dismounted their infantry, and so you had, for some, in some instances, actually cross the pole shelling of the Ukrainian vehicles or of the Ukrainian tanks, and the reconnaissance was provided by the Orlan 10 drones. And earlier on, so this is not really from the counterattack, but it's definitely happening at the same time in unison, but you do have FAB strikes on the general Ukrainian locations. And here's what's most interesting. You had the DPR's Sparta Battalion release a 3-minute video showing their FPVs hitting various Ukrainian pieces of equipment as they were making their way to try to push the Russians out of Tonenke. And so during that entire video, you see really many strikes, over 15 strikes, I'd say, off the top of my head, targeting various Ukrainian MTLBs, BMP-1s, BMP-2s, targeting T-72s, T-64s. Those were the various Soviet vehicles that were utilized, and then there was at least one Martyr 1A3 that was abandoned by the Ukrainians during the assault on Tonenke. So there was also some Western weaponry that was lost in this assault. And in the end, most of the losses incurred by the Ukrainians during this attack were due to the FPV strikes by the Sparta Battalion. And as you can see, the Ukrainians were not able to solidify control of the western section, and so it still remains a gray zone. So you could say, on the one hand, over the past 4 days, the Ukrainians were successful in preventing further Russian assaults, and in holding the line several hundred meters to the south of Simanivka. But on the other hand, they did not preserve any sort of foothold within the village that could be used to protract the fighting for an especially long period of time looking into the future. Looking a bit further north at Orlivka, at this point, I have not seen any indication that the Ukrainians re-entered the village. It is still likely that the western section is a gray zone, as we've not seen any footage from either side from this area. We did see a lot of footage of the Russian side hoisting flags, like around this school over here, or videos of the Ukrainians striking the Russian positions in eastern Orlivka. So the Russian forces have constructed for themselves this forward operating node to further develop their offensive past the water barrier around the Duvna River located over here. But at the moment, the Ukrainians are hitting it pretty hard. You could see that based on some of these videos. Remember the 110th Brigade that fought in southern Avdiivka and northern Avdiivka for really several years now. So their brigade, although it has mainly been moved away from the front line and replaced by new units that are less attrited, they are still involved to a certain capacity, as can be seen in this video, where their drones targeted the Russian side, that had FPV drones flying into the Russian dugouts, or grenades dropping onto Russian infantrymen as they were entering into the town itself, into this eastern part. And then over here, you had the 25th Brigade dropping grenades onto Russian soldiers as well as they were setting up camp in the village. But the Ukrainians likely don't want to put in a massive amount of resources into Orlivka, simply because the gray zone at the moment is located in one of the lowest elevated areas on the entire part of this sector, because this western section of Orlivka is right next to the river and all the lowlands. It's very difficult to set up a permanent position over there, especially with the Russians several kilometers eastwards, located in the coke plant in the 9th district and on the Donetsk ridge overlooking all of that area of Orlivka. So setting up camp over there is very difficult. So the Ukrainians have simply opted to fall back behind the river in the specific area and try to at least maintain several hundred meters of gray zone between the Russians in the east and the Ukrainians in Simanivka. In Berdichi, we likely saw the most Ukrainian activity, and it's mainly been from the 47th Mechanized Brigade. They've been fighting on the front, you could say, since November, but they weren't really that exhausted throughout the entire time period. Of course, they have been attrited to a certain extent due to fighting in one of the fiercest battles of the war so far, but they were mainly present throughout the battle on the northern flank of Avdiivka, which in the months of February and January were not that affected by the immense amount of losses that the Ukrainians suffered within the city itself. And so they do still retain most of their fighting force and the vast majority of their vehicles, although now they're sending a lot of that Western provided equipment to the front line, really the ground zero in these valleys, into battlefields like Berdichi, in order to hold the line for as long as possible to make up for a lack of Ukrainian firepower. And in the last video, we talked about how they were successful in repelling one of Russia's initial assaults into Berdichi along this road in particular, on mark in red. The Russian forces, they tried to dismount in that area. They were countered by Ukrainian Bradley fire and various FPV drones that targeted the dismounted infantry that were in a pretty large squad. And yeah, that broke up the initial Russian assault. And by doing so, the eastern section of Berdichi remained a gray zone. But in the following days since that attack, which I believe occurred on the 26th of February, the Ukrainian forces of the 47th, they reorganized their forces that were located in the westernmost sections of the village around various forested areas, and sent in additional armored assets into the center of the village to try to solidify control and push the Russians completely out. And so the Ukrainians, they sent in several Abrams tanks, and in addition, to support the operations of those tanks and of the other infantry fighting vehicles, they moved in some of their extremely rare M1150 assault breacher vehicles. And so they're based on the chassis of the Abrams tank, and they are crucial in clearing out the minefields that have been set up by the Russian forces, especially in some of these open fields in between Stepove and Berdichi. And so the point of moving in those assault breacher vehicles was in order to pave the way for an opening where the Abrams and other vehicles could freely roam and attack the Russian positions with their firepower. The downside to moving in such a large concentration of Western equipment to the line of contact in a valley, which is important to remember because this area is located in a valley overlooked by the coke plants. That's where a lot of strikes are noticed and directed from. And so by virtue of all that, it was really bound that there would be vehicular losses. And now we're beginning to see that. We now have geolocated footage confirming the second destruction of an Abrams tank. So 2 out of the 31 have already been destroyed. And so in the second incident where the M1 Abrams was destroyed in this road in the southern part of Berdichi, it's reported that either the tank was hit by an RPG that hit the caterpillar of the tank, or that it ran over an anti-tank mine. Either way, what was reported is that it was demobilized and that the crew was forced to abandon it. And then at that point, you had the Ghoul drone unit of the Russian side launching 2 FPVs that struck directly into the tank. And so that was done in order to ensure that it was destroyed and cannot be recovered by the Ukrainians. So that one was destroyed. And then at around the same time period, additional footage was released which showed the destruction of the M1150 ABV, just if you measure it 220 meters to the northeast. So it was definitely involved in trying to pave the way for the Abrams, but both of them were destroyed in this entire course of the battle. And the reason why you have these ABVs being moved in, as I said before, is because it's been a very large, widespread complaint from the Ukrainian command that they've been unable to deal with the concentration of Russian mines throughout the line of contact, especially in the gray zone, especially due to the fact that even when certain minefields are cleared by the Ukrainians, the Russian forces are firing additional mine charges from 5 to 15 kilometers away with their remote mining systems. And so this was supposed to be a potential remedy. We started seeing them reported on the shipment of these vehicles in around November. Now we're actually seeing their utilization. I don't know how many there are exactly. The reports I've seen, they span from 6 to 8 such systems. And this is already the second ABV that's been destroyed by the Russian forces. So in summation, the Ukrainians were able to push back the Russians from eastern Berdichi. But at the same time, they were unable to utilize vehicles to solidify control over the central section of the village. So for now, their more solid line of defense is several hundred meters westward, located along these various forested areas that are being now turned into a tentative defense line that is connected to the larger one around Semenivka. And lastly, moving on to Novomykhailivka, the Russian forces have developed their offensive and continued advancing deeper into the village center from their attack vector from the south. So the Russian forces, in the last video, I discussed how they were able to break past the Ukrainian defenses near the cemetery and the warehouses. And that gave them direct access to the village center. And so from there, they've been able to advance through 2 streets, Shevchenko and Sobornaya streets. And by virtue of doing so, they took over the church of Archangel Michael. And now they release footage of themselves within that position, which confirms their latest advance, which if we measure it with the measuring stick is about 350 meters north. And now it's being reported by the Russian sources that they're being fired upon from those newly acquired positions from the Ministry of Culture building and the local school in the region. So that should give you an idea of where the battlefield is currently at. The Ukrainians are fighting house for house right now. They are extremely steadfast in their defense, and the reason why is because the Ukrainians do still have a certain number of squads located in this eastern section of Novomykhailivka. And as you can see, the Russian forces formed this mini pincer maneuver, like they're attacking from this direction, the southern flank, and also from the east at the same time, with the southern flank being more powerful, and that is putting the Ukrainian positions to the east in jeopardy. And so there's still no information about whether the Ukrainians in the east have withdrawn yet, but it's definitely the case that the Ukrainians are trying to hold on to the line over here in the rear in order to prevent an isolation or further collapse of the front line. At the same time, the Russian forces are launching heavy artillery and airstrikes on the Ukrainian positions that are a bit further north, marked around here in these warehouses and in some of these forested areas that are manned by the 79th Air Assault Brigade. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.